Hello everyone and welcome to this, our third Parkwell webinar. My name is Dan Macy. I'm a recruiter working across financial services, focusing mainly on wealth management and private banking. This topic then is one that is close to my heart. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our speakers and panelists have to say. Today we will be talking about something that is key to growing any business in today's climate, and that is how to make your firm an attractive place for millennials to work. I'm delighted to say that we will be joined by Zandy N. Carter, the Belonging, Inclusion and Diversity Lead at Investec, who will be talking to us about some of her experiences there. Zandy will then be followed by my colleague, Prash Arora, who, and I know this because I've seen the slides, has some very interesting thoughts on what millennials are looking for in a new role and how best to keep them motivated once they are in that role. Finally, we will have a panel discussion to talk about some of the points raised in the presentation. I'm pleased to say that Zandy will stay with us and join the panel alongside James Gordinifer, Head of Student Talent Attraction and Acquisition at Ernst & Young, and Jackie Falvey of HR Consultancy Forest, who will be able to give us the viewpoint from outside a business. I should say at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. So if at any point during the presentations you think of a question that you'd like me to ask during the panel session, please do fill that in and I'll do my best to ask the panel if we have time. So enough from me with that. I'm thrilled to say that our first speaker is Zandy, the Belonging, Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Investec, and over to you, Zandy.
Great. Hi, everyone. So my name is Zandy Carter. I'm the Belonging, Inclusion, Diversity Lead at Investec. Just a little bit about me. So I started my career in the 90s. For some or other bizarre reason, I wanted to be an accountant. And I applied and got into PwC. And when I arrived there, I arrived as a school leaver. I was one of very few women, and one of two Black women at that. So it was quite strange for me as an 18-year-old coming into this massive, great big office and kind of starting my life there. I quickly realized that I didn't really like accounting very much, but I decided, let me just stay and get my qualification and then leave. So 5 years later, I left. I joined the BBC. And then I wanted to go off and save the world. So I joined VSO and they sent me out to South Africa. So I spent a number of years in South Africa. First taught accounting for a while, then I moved further and further away from accounting into education and administration within education. My final role before I left, coming back, was at the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town, where I was looking after executive education. But I returned to London and got a role at Investec, and it was quite weird because I returned back to the city after over 20 years of leaving. And what I found was that whilst the skyline had changed, the composition of people within the organization that I was working for hadn't really changed very much. It was still very white and very male. So I joined as head of graduate recruitment and development. And so I thought I would try and bring some diversity through that way. So I was very keen on bringing in diversity, not just in terms of gender and race, but also in terms of university. So we didn't just go to the usual suspects, the usual Russell Group universities, and also wanted to get some diversity in terms of qualifications. So it wasn't just economics and finance, it was arts, it was classics, it was history, it was psychology, and then started to play around with apprenticeships rather than just graduates. So had a lot of fun in doing that. So I think I surprised a number of people when we got these hordes of young people coming into the organization who looked and sounded and felt a lot different to the norm. About 3 years into that role, I got over a course of a couple of months, I had a few people leave. I had 6 people leave, and they were all women, and they were all women of color. And in having conversations with them around why they were leaving, one of the key reasons was that There were no visible role models, and which meant that they felt that there wasn't a place for them. So it was quite devastating to hear that, and to begin to think about, well, what is it that we need to do? So whilst my attention had been focused on, getting people through the door, I hadn't really thought about the experience of whilst they were there. So as an organization, we were starting to rethink what our response was going to be around belonging, inclusion, diversity, not just because of the feedback that we were getting there, but because, the increase in regulation and legislation, and because, we wanted to be an employer of choice. And so the role was created, the vision was set, and the vision really is about an ease of being within the organization. But we know that it's critical, to attract millennials. This is a key thing that they're looking for. They're looking for an environment which is inclusive, which reflects them, and where they can feel a sense of belonging. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Nick? So really what I'll do in the next sort of 8 or so minutes is kind of give you a sense of who the millennials are, start to unpack what means to them. And if you're not convinced, I'm going to give you a commercial case. And then finally, I'll throw in one more argument. But let's move to the next slide, which is really about who are these young people? Who are these millennials? Whether they're defined as people born around the sort of the early 1980s, so sort of 1981 to about the mid 90s. So the oldest would be about in their late 30s now in the organization, or just in the world, not just the organization. And there was an article that said that by 2025, which is not that long away, it's in 4 years' time, by 2025, 75% of the workforce will comprise millennials. They have 4 key characteristics that are kind of displayed in this picture, actually, that they're technologically savvy. So technology is an extension of who they are. They also want to work flexibly, and they prefer opportunity rather than job security. I know when I first started, it was all about getting a job for life. These guys aren't really interested in that. They're looking for the different opportunities. The third characteristic is around that they are socially responsible. And they want to work for an organization whose values represent and reflect theirs. So, in thinking about as a firm, what you stand for is something that they're going to ask you about. So when I was particularly in recruitment, there were a lot of questions around who we were, what the culture was of the organization, and what we stood for as an organization. And the fourth is that they are a very diverse group of professionals, probably the most diverse that we've seen so far. So they want to see diversity reflected within that organization. It might be worth just noting also that Gen Z, which is the generation just behind them, who were born sort of mid 90s to about 2010, who are if in their mid 20s at the oldest, they are even more diverse, and they're even more socially engaged. Let's move to the next slide. So what matters to these millennials? So, these pictures kind of depict these guys are really socially conscious and aware, and will voice their opinion. So you can see here, the Me Too, and more recently, Black Lives Matter, particularly over the last year. When I worked at the University of Cape Town at the Graduate School of Business, one of the things that I did whilst I was there was my MBA. And I actually did it on engaging millennial talent. I spoke to over 13 executives in 11 organizations in 2 countries. And then I also held focus groups with over 40 millennials, identifying 8 core drivers, and just 2 of them. One was about purpose. The purpose of the business is really, really important to them. And as I've said before, the culture experienced by them in an organization should reflect their values. When I was doing some research for this conversation, and about 5 years ago, over 50% of millennials were actively seeking inclusion and diversity from their employers. Let's move on to the next slide. So what is belonging, inclusion, and diversity? And because it's so critical to attracting millennials, I thought I'd just spend, just one slide talking about it. And I've stolen this quote, although I've acknowledged her, from Verna Myers, and she's the VP of Inclusion at Netflix. And she uses the analogy of diversity being invited to the party, inclusion about being asked to dance. And at Investec, we say belonging is like dancing like no one's watching. So diversity is really about representation and the mix. Inclusion is about making sure the mix works well together. And belonging is really a felt sense of feeling like you're valued, you're seen, you're heard, and you're respected. So millennials are really, really keen on this idea of cognitive diversity that comes through the diversity of people, and they feel that it's essential for an inclusive culture. Let's move on to the next slide. Thanks, Nick. So if you're not fully sold on the moral argument, I'll just throw in some commercials here, which is really about, Deloitte's in 2019 put out a report and said, diverse and inclusive organizations, if they are diverse and inclusive, they are more likely, twice as likely to meet and exceed financial targets, 3 times as likely to be high performing, 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile. And we know that this is important for those organizations that are looking for a growth strategy, and 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. So we've learned our lessons from not being diverse, and being suffering from groupthink. Diversity just knocks all of that out the water. So it has a strong case. Let's move on to the next slide. Just the final slide really is about, if you're still not convinced, and you prefer the stick to the carrot, there is and will continue to be heaps of regulation and legislation heading our way. And I've just, in the last few years, this is the legislation and regulation that we have. So we've got obviously the gender pay gap. We've got the Women in Finance Charter that's really pushing women in leadership roles. We've got the Hampton-Alexander, which is about gender representation at a board level and the level below. Ethnicity pay gap. The Parker Review, which is about ethnicity at board level. The Race at Work Charter, if you haven't signed up to that, I'd encourage you to do that. That sets out 5 specific actions. The FCA, you may have seen last week the CEO of the FCA talking about, they were thinking about increasingly asking organizations more tough questions about representation and about culture, making sure that it's more open and inclusive. And then workforce engagement, which is part of the corporate governance requirement that, wanting to hear the voice of the employee in the boardroom. So the initial question that I was asked to talk about was really about, making your firm more attractive for millennials. And so I hope I've given you just a really brief overview of who they are, what matters to them, and within that belonging, inclusion, diversity is something that is really key in terms of what matters to them. And I've also just thrown in a commercial argument as well as a legal argument. Thank you. That's it for me.
Thanks very much.
Sorry, hand back to Dan. That's what I was meant to say. Handing back to you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Zandy. That's brilliant. I mean, wow, a lot, certainly for me, and I imagine for a few of us to think about there. Really very interesting. And perhaps now we could go over to my colleague Prash to hear some of your thoughts, Prash.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. Following on from that great presentation from Zandy, I'll be looking at areas of talent management that drive retention and engagement of millennials. If I could have my first slide, please. Just a quick introduction on myself. I have over 10 years senior level search experience within wealth and asset management. Prior to that, I have a background in front office asset management, managing global equities. On to my next slide, please. And for those of you who are new to Parkwell, we are a management consultancy running change and transformation projects for clients with particular expertise in the private banking, wealth and asset management sectors. The recruitment arm, which is led by Dan and myself, we have a strong track record hiring key staff across all business functions in these sectors. And on to my next slide, please. So it is said that millennials as a group are more diverse, more educated and more technologically savvy than any other generation. They are often unfairly categorized by distinct stereotypes, but one thing we know is that this generation will be dominating the workforce and C-suite in the coming years. Millennials are collaborative and expect to be included in decision-making. Helping them to understand their purpose is a key to getting them their buy-in. Millennials offer innovative solutions and ideas and naturally take a global view reflecting our globalized culture. This out-of-the-box thinking is a key driver for revenues in an increasingly competitive environment. This group are therefore integral to the future of wealth managers as they grow their client base and secure the next generation of diverse clients. If I could have my next slide, please. And let's have a look at where we are at the moment. The shift to a more remote workplace has meant the need for firms to re-evaluate how their business operates. The pandemic has accelerated technological enhancements. The wealth management industry has been built on strong personal relationships and face-to-face meetings, and new forms of communication are now in place to engage with clients and employees. Research suggests remote working for a significant length of time for the younger generation has been particularly challenging. Key concerns for them are maintaining communication and career progression while working from home. So with flexible working set to continue, what can you do to enhance the retention of millennials in your firm? Could I have my next slide, please? Firstly, we'll have a look at career development. Research shows millennials rank career progression as one of the most important factors in taking a new role. Millennials value a broader range of career end goals. These will range from having the desire to lead, pursue entrepreneurship, or develop specific technical expertise. So they require an environment that accommodates their professional needs. A clear and structured training and development program needs to be in place. As well as formal training, learning on the job is key, and this is especially difficult while working from home. So learning programs must be tailored with virtual real-life training. Also, given that AI is already replacing jobs, this appetite for continuous learning and development will become increasingly important. A culture built on this continuous learning helps employee engagement and ultimately staff retention. On my next slide, please. Flexible and remote working were once seen as an innovative perk, but as a result of the pandemic, many businesses have been forced to adopt it and have in turn realized that remote and flexible working can be positive. Research suggests just over half of millennials that plan to stay with their current employer for at least 5 years want the flexibility to choose where they work. As a generation that grew up with the world on a screen at their fingertips, location does not carry the same importance. Research shows that when employees effectively make their own choices about how, where, and when they work, they are healthier, less stressed, more productive, and more engaged. Being able to offer generous, flexible working is a key factor of your employer brand. On my next slide, please. Millennials thrive in achieving short-term successes and have a need for clear goals and regular feedback. Although the desire to be successful is natural, for this generation, expectations over timeframes have shortened. They expect to be given development opportunities. It is about creating a system that offers regular feedback. The traditional annual appraisal is not enough. Regular one-to-ones are invaluable for this generation, so well-structured and goal-orientated programs providing constant feedback are very effective. And you can reward extra benefits to those that exceed expectations. Talking of benefits, on my next slide, the benefits packages that companies offer have a well-being program in place to recognize the positive impact that it has on employees. But the past 12 months has forced firms to review their packages to meet the demands and challenges of the current climate. Research suggests only 50% of millennials evaluated a job offer based on salary and other financial incentives. So it is evident that employers need to offer a comprehensive package of bespoke and family-friendly benefits for employees. Again, the benefits package is a key factor for your employer brand. And my next slide, please. So we've heard about diversity and inclusion, and all companies now consider it as a core part of their people strategy. Research suggests millennials are more likely to stay with an employer for longer if the workforce and senior management teams are diverse. This is a particular issue for the wealth management industry. When recruiting, candidate selection has to be tailored to reduce unconscious bias. This can be achieved by ability tests, personality questionnaires, and virtual assessments. Looking at the bigger picture within the UK wealth and asset management sectors, there are some great initiatives in place to address equality, and prioritising these issues helps to attract and retain a diverse workforce. On my next slide, we'll have a look at corporate social responsibility. CSR is an increasingly important aspect of any employer's brand and can be critical in attracting the best young talent to your business. Millennials support greater loyalty to companies that contribute to an environmental or social cause. Research suggests around 80% of millennials would like companies to publicly commit to CSR policies, and 82% would strive to be employed by a company recognized for its commitment to business ethics. These statistics show that the traditional drivers of the attractiveness of a workplace, such as money and prestige, are no longer dominant. Further research tells us that firms that consult their employees on CSR and allow them to get involved in any activities are the ones that are more likely to see higher engagement and retention. You also need to have clarity on your ESG stance. Wealth managers need to show they practice what they preach in terms of their sustainability goals. And can I have my next slide, please? So recruiting millennials is essentially just recruiting. The key is keeping up with trends, technology, and expectations. If you are not adapting your growth to accommodate a modern workforce, you can't expect to attract the best talent and in turn develop a strong client base. Relationships between employees and managers have never been more important, and communication and flexibility has put an increased focus on employee benefits and flexible working, with bespoke and family-friendly benefits at the top of requirements for everyone. Within wealth management, continuity of individuals is very important to clients, so focus is needed on staff retention so that clients remain with the firm. And finally, it is all very well having a multi-generational workforce, but it is also about providing the right opportunities to the younger generation and about educating the existing workforce on current attitudes and trends. So I hope that's given you a few takeaway points. Thank you very much for listening, and back to Dan.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Prash. Another great presentation, and again, a lot to think about. And perhaps we could take some of that into our panel discussion now. I'm pleased to say that Zandy is staying with us and will be joining us on this panel, but there'll be two other people joining us. I introduced them briefly earlier, but perhaps we could start with them telling us a little bit about themselves. So James is joining us from Ernst & Young. Perhaps James, you could tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So hi everyone, happy to be on today's session, and hopefully you find some of my insights useful. I lead student recruitment for EY in the UK. I've been with the firm for around 7 years or so, and it's one of those things. I'd never done student recruitment before. I kind of fell into it from a more traditional experience hire recruitment role, and I hadn't looked back. And obviously I've progressed through the firm into the role that I have now, and very, very proud of the role that I do, and much of what the guys have talked through so far has resonated, and hopefully bring to life some examples from our perspective that will be helpful for you all.
Excellent. Thanks, James. And perhaps now we could go over to Jackie, who could tell us a little bit about herself and perhaps a little bit about Forest as well. Oh, sorry. James, could you hand back to me?
Yeah, what do you need me to do?
Oh, sorry. Could we now go over to Jackie so she can tell us a little bit about Forest and a little bit about herself?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Jackie Falvey from Forest HR. What can I say about us? We are a bespoke outsourced HR consultancy. We look after predominantly small and medium-sized businesses who don't have their own in-house HR. I came to that in my journey after spending at least 10 years in the City of London in insurance companies, heading up HR and training departments. So diversity, inclusion, corporate social responsibility, all very, very close to my heart in that respect. But now we have the added complication of a variety of businesses who all think and act very, very differently. So hopefully I can bring some of that to the discussion.
Excellent. Thanks very much indeed, Jackie. So I'm pleased to say also, as I said, Zandy is also joining us. But perhaps we could start with you, Jackie. As you're there on screen, let's start with you. Have you sort of thought about any strategies for attracting graduates or recruits who are at this early stage of their career? Is that something you get involved in, or is that perhaps something that we should speak to James about?
We do get involved in that, probably nowhere near as much as James, but I think the biggest thing at the moment we get a lot of inquiries about is the Kickstart scheme, because that really is focusing on attracting the younger population as they're coming out of education and actually giving them an opportunity. So I've got an artisan burger restaurant of all places, which is quite an unusual one, that they've taken advantage of that to take on a chef under the Kickstart scheme. So that tends to be the biggest thing that we have with our clients at the moment. But James can probably give you more on that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Could we go over to James then, please? It'd be good to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So EY is, well known as a major recruiter of school leavers and graduates and everything in between in terms of work experience and internships and inside programs and all sorts. I believe that professional services is currently the second largest recruiter of students in the UK, behind the public sector, actually. And so, yeah, we have a whole range of programs where we bring students in. In terms of attraction strategy, we've been in the market for a number of years now, so we've got very well formed and established relationships with a range of universities, you can imagine. Over recent years, obviously speaking to this notion of diversity and certainly social mobility, we've been more focused on how we expand that group of universities and appeal to a much broader range so that we can kind of support students from different backgrounds and not recruit from a traditional mold as such. So that's been a really key focus for us. We started a school leaver program around probably about 8 or 9 years ago. So again, that brought new challenges in terms of an attraction strategy and a different approach in terms of how you engage with schools compared to universities, for example. But we do a lot of activity with our alumni. So one of the things that we find certainly with this generation of talent is they want to engage with people like them. And so it's really important that we are authentic in the way that we engage and the way that we present to students in this market. So we like to put our best people front and center, and we like to put the most diverse group of people that we possibly can out at different events that we would run. Obviously, over the past year, we've been running everything virtually, which has brought both challenge but also opportunity, and there are certainly things that we will probably never do the same. moving forward, and we've seen some benefits from operating virtually. But obviously we're craving the opportunity to connect face to face and be in a room with students once again. But I would say that some of those big milestone virtual events where we've been able to present to, in our case, over 2,000 students on one event, we would never be able to do that in a room at a university or in a careers fair. We'd never see that many people in a day. So that's been a big learning curve for us, certainly over the past year or so. And again, it appeals to that broader audience. We can attract, you know, a much more diverse population. And if we embrace themes such as, you know, working with ethnic minorities, or it could be, you know, kind of around International Women's Day, for example, you know, we're appealing to a very specific audience again, and a much bigger volume of students as well. So yeah, that's been a great learn over the past year or so, and probably some of the highlights I would draw out.
Yeah, it's amazing to think just how many people you're getting in front of like that. I wonder, could we go over to Zandy to see what do Investec have any strategies, or how does it work there?
Yeah, so pretty much, you know, what James had spoken about. So we do, well, I mean, pre-COVID, we did sort of the career fairs, etc. And one of the other things was internships for us were quite a key thing to, as a feeder into the grad program. So it was an opportunity, I think, for the interns to almost try before they buy, and as well as the employer as well. So, you know, it's an extended interview, isn't it, really? So that was a key one for us. And then we would do things like study weeks, yeah, I think James has really covered it in terms of our approaches. So nothing else to add, really.
Great, thanks. I wonder, you know, we've talked about a few different points there. Something that I'd like to pick up on is the kind of changes in company culture. Jackie, is that something that you've seen at all?
Absolutely. I think the pandemic has forced a lot of businesses that were of the view you cannot work from home, you have to be in the office, to you have to work from home because of the pandemic. And I think that's changed how they look at things going forward. We've had quite a few clients that have closed down their offices because now their workforce are able to work from home. But that brings its own risks, because we have to do risk assessments at home to look after their health and well-being more, because they're not in an environment with other people every day. So the culture has changed hugely in that respect, because the demand is there for the agile working and the hybrid working. And if companies haven't done that already, they are looking at it. So we've changed a lot of contracts, put in a lot of programs to help those smaller employers as well. So not the larger companies, the smaller employers, where these people are like their family. So the need to look after them is so ingrained in there as well, because they may have had this person working with them for 24 years and now suddenly it's all changed. So we are working quite closely with those smaller businesses to implement those programs. Health and well-being, we're doing a lot on that, and the mental health side of things, to make sure that people are looked after in that agile hybrid working.
Brilliant, thanks, Jackie. And James, have you seen company culture change much at EY since you've been there?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, as mentioned, the pandemic has accelerated a number of factors. We've always been pretty good when it comes to flexible working, but obviously we've had no choice but to embrace that. I think with that, you know, the underpinning factor for me is always trust. And I think that has been absolutely critical, certainly in my own experience with my own team, which is significant, but certainly across the firm. You know, there is a contract between you that's not written as such. It's, you know, it's that kind of trust between employee and employer. And I think that's a really key factor. So, you know, kind of being more trusting and kind of looking more at output rather than what hours of the day somebody's working, because, you know, with all the stuff around things like working mums, or, you know, people that are living on their own, they have a completely different work-life pattern. And so being able to kind of accept that, and as long as the job gets done, I think is a cultural shift that we're seeing, definitely. I also think it was interesting when we first started this discussion today, we were having a chat about what it's going to be like to return to work, and whether people will wear suits again, and kind of clothing and things like that, like what kind of stuff. And I think it's important, because I don't know about other people on this call, but I felt it's almost I'm not saying EY was hierarchical, but certainly you've got some really senior people within the firm, and in an office setting with that kind of typical culture of the office environment. Sometimes that can be quite intimidating when meeting, let's say, a partner, or having a meeting with a senior person. But there's something disarming about the way that we're working at the minute, and seeing somebody in their home environment where all of a sudden you're on the same page, you're on the same level, even though you might have different roles. And I think that's brought something new and something quite interesting as well to the firm. And absolutely echo the piece about well-being. I think that's going to be absolutely critical for us as organisations, and certainly as leaders within firms, to be looking after our people in a completely different way. And from a student talent point of view, they're possibly going to be the hardest hit in terms of well-being, certainly in terms of lost learning, lost opportunities for social interaction, and in some cases, because it's the first, well, it will be the first proper job a lot of people have ever had. How do you get them to connect with the brand and with each other in a way that you would normally just by having a chat by a coffee, kind of making a coffee, or going out for a walk, or perhaps to the pub after work? How do you emulate that? There's some big challenges as well to navigate, I think.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. Can I pass that over to you as well, Zandy? What have you seen in terms of company culture changing at Investec?
Yeah, I think it's a lot to do with what I was speaking about earlier, which is around sort of the inclusive culture. But I think it's the other pieces around speaking up, creating an environment where people can speak up. And it speaks a bit to what James was saying about, the hierarchy, that, the pandemic has been a great leveler to a certain extent. And what we've seen is that we've seen a different side of leadership as well, that there's more sort of an empathetic, authentic type of leader coming through, because you are now getting to see their kids and their pets and their everything else is on show. But yeah, I think the other thing that's changed within the culture is around just being more considerate of the family friendly policies. So we don't talk about maternity leave or anything, we talk about parental leave. We had flexible working before the pandemic. This has accelerated that, but we are working remotely, not necessarily flexibly. So that's one of the challenges that we are also facing. I think Prash also mentioned in his presentation about the importance of educating the current workforce. So we're having to do a lot of work on that, and just updating their databases, as it were, in terms of what they think the world of work is, because it has most definitely moved on. That's what I'd add.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I've had a question come in, and it's probably for Jackie, actually, this one. So if we could go to Jackie. Given the pull factor reasons discussed, is it going to be harder for smaller companies to attract millennials? I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, Jackie.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be more challenging. I think it can be turned to an advantage, because actually, if you are a smaller company, you may be able to give more focus to a millennial. You may be able to give them that flexibility, because you are that smaller company. But it will be more challenging because the funding isn't necessarily there to be able to spend the money on anything that is particularly fancy, for want of a better word. So I think challenging is the word I would use. I don't think it's impossible, but I think we will need to work harder at how we attract those millennials, because again, it is about the health and well-being, the career progressions. What can we show them that are in place? The agile working, the hybrid working, what's in place for that? All of those things can still count. It will just be more challenging, I think.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jackie. So I think perhaps one sort of last question we could move to, if we go to James. James, have you seen any main trends emerging sort of in the industry that have worked for attracting millennials?
Yeah, I think there's a few things probably to call out. I touched on this at the start, but authenticity is key.
Yeah.
So moving away from traditional job descriptions, reams of text explaining roles, and moving more towards kind of just authentic language that is easy to digest, and also much more in terms of picture form and video, is a really key shift in the market. And no surprises, a lot of this is to do with how this generation is communicating, obviously through social media. So what then kind of comes next is actually in terms of engagement through social media, and it kind of depends if you're talking about millennials or Gen Z. In our world, we're focusing on Gen Z in terms of the role that I do. Things that you kind of would assume, like Facebook, Twitter, etc. Actually, that sits more with millennials and what millennials are comfortable using. Gen Z is far more around Instagram, Snapchat, and YouTube as well. So, kind of putting energy into tools that perhaps, certainly I don't use or I'm not au fait with, but kind of some of my team will be, and certainly experts in the industry. You've got to look at where are they communicating and how do they communicate, and that is different to my generation. So kind of getting your head around that is really key. The other aspect that comes with that then is obviously around celebrity and influencers. This is a big deal certainly for kind of the generation coming through now. So actually, there's an element of, like I say, wanting to hear from people like them. So putting role models in front of them from the firm that are, within reach, not necessarily partners and future leaders and so on. Might be interesting to hear from them, and we certainly do kind of showcase some of the great work that they do, but they actually want an authentic message from people like them. But they're also very kind of drawn to the age of celebrity and influencers online. So, kind of coupling onto that and tuning into who they are following and whether or not that speaks to your brand is another key thing.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, James. And Zandy, do you have any thoughts on those trends?
I think what we saw at Investec as well was what we ran was a rotational grad program. So the people so they didn't go necessarily join a specific team, that they would get experience in different teams, because sometimes they come into the environment, they don't actually know what the front office does, opposed to what a settlements team does, what the charities team does. So we would give them sort of a couple of months within those different teams, and they really, really appreciated that. I think it was quite a key differentiator for us. So, that whole idea of kind of gig working, so working on small projects for a period of time and then moving on to something else, I think was quite an appealing thing for millennials.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. And perhaps we could go to you, Jackie. Did you have any thoughts on the trends?
I think, again, to pick up on what James said with the social media side of things, so looking at the smaller businesses, that's particularly a trend that they need to get on board with, but they find quite difficult because their social media presence may not have been that good. And if it was, then it's not that up to date. So I absolutely agree with that social media. I've got 5 stepchildren myself that are all sort of between the ages of 19 and 23. They teach me a lot about the modern world. And quite often I get the phrase of, "You're so old," because I look at Facebook rather than at other social media tools that are out there. So that is a really great grounding to have that, because that helps me to look at what I do in my role to attract just those kinds of people. So they are my role models. They're who I use.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks very much. Perhaps I could wrap up here and just see if anybody had anything further to add. James, did you have anything else you wanted to say at this point?
I don't think so. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and obviously, the other panelists and Prash as well have given a really thorough overview. So I'm all good unless there's any further questions, but thank you.
I think that's it. So thanks very much. And Zandy?
Nothing further to add from my side. I was just listening, as I'm listening to James and Jackie and social media, I get exhausted just at the idea of trying to keep up with all of that. So, I hope you people who are listening and watching this aren't feeling too overwhelmed, but, you've probably got some younger kids, etc., who can help you with all of the stuff. But good luck
Brilliant.
to everyone.
Thanks, Sandy. And Jackie, did you have anything further to add?
I just think it's been great to listen to the panelists as well, to hear what they have to say and to keep that open mind. I think that is the biggest thing. It's the open mind of anything kind of goes. Let's look at it, adapt and overcome.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks very much, Jackie. And if we could come back to me. That would be fantastic. Brilliant. Thanks very much. Good to see you all again. So I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope you have too. It really just leaves me now just to say thank you very much to the panel. I think we had some really interesting thoughts, and there's a lot to take away from us there. I hope you enjoyed this. As you will see coming up there, if you did, we've got a few more things coming up. Wednesday the 28th of April is Compeers Wealth Tech, and Prash and I will be back on the 13th of May to talk about post-virus. Is this the new way of working? Well, hopefully May doesn't end up being too early for that chat to be post-virus. And who knows, maybe by May I might have even had a haircut. So that's something we could all look forward to. But mostly I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we will see you soon. So thanks very much indeed. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.